Howdy everyone! For today's Jolly Lark, we're jumping back into Borderlands with the Iron Bear. This is a cool one that's got a neat camouflage pattern. Now, camouflage can seem a little tricky or intimidating to paint, but I'm going to show you some techniques today that make it a little faster and easier. So to start with, what we've got here is the model that's been base coated in a gray all over. And then I've painted all of the panels in some sort of green. We're going to basically paint over all of the green. This is just kind of to block out the color and provide a green base coat for what we're going to do next. With this green base coat in place and the gray, we're then going to give the entire model a quick wash with VALLEJO's black wash. This will just help define the panels and give some kind of black line shading in the gray areas, and provide a little bit of shading underneath the greens we're then going to put on next. But this is more important to focus on the gray areas. So with that done, we're then going to go in and paint the camouflage pattern. Now, I am not trying to paint the exact camouflage pattern as it appears on the box art or it appears in the game, just trying to give the impression of a similar style of camouflage that the Iron Bear has in Borderlands. Thin your paints a little bit with water. You don't want to put on big clumpy globs of paint, but you're just going to set out 4 different colors of green. One of the colors you'll notice on the text there I made by mixing 2 colors because I didn't have anything in the Vallejo range that seemed like a good match. And we're just going to move all around the model. Got all 4 colors of green on the paint palette, and just kind of move around the model and putting on those kind of stripy blotches that the Iron Bear has in the game. Now this is where that green base coat is important, because what that green base coat is letting you do is, 1, be a little messy with your camouflage pattern. If you miss a spot, it's still going to be green. It's also going to let you paint the camouflage pattern in one go without having to do another coat of any of the colors. All of these colors of green, from the dark brown to the light olive one, should cover that medium green base coat pretty well. With the camouflage colors down, I'm going to go in and put a light gray highlight on all of the gray areas. Now, when you're highlighting Borderlands miniatures, the comic book cel-shaded style that Borderlands has actually almost lets you do kind of a lazy, non-metallic metal highlighting scheme where you're just kicking a little bit of the light gray on the top surfaces, on the flat top surfaces, and on the edges. And you can pretty quickly approximate the sort of cel-shaded highlighting on metals that you get in the Borderlands style. Rather than using metallic paints, we're going to go with grays on all of the steel surfaces. On any given piece of steel, make sure you're leaving some of the middle gray base coat visible. The highlights don't work if they're not a little pop of color. If you totally cover up that medium gray, you're not going to get the effect of a highlight. Something to watch out for, grays do dry a little darker. Many paints dry a little darker. So you can see here I've finished up with the cold gray highlight, and now I'm going back in with an even brighter gray, the wolf gray, which is a very light gray, and just putting a real thin highlights on top of the areas that got the medium gray previously. So at this stage, you've now got 4 colors on all of the metal areas. You've got the black washed into the recesses, you've got the medium gray base coat, and then 2 layers of highlights on top of that. This bright gray highlight, this is what's giving the sheen to the miniature, and you can even put in some kind of comic book style little reflection lines. Just make sure you keep all of the brightest gray within the previous highlight. So let's slow it down for just a second, and I'll show you exactly what I mean. So on these flat surfaces on top of the Iron Bear, if you just leave those as is, you're going to end up with kind of a flat looking surface because, it's a flat surface. But by adding some little edge highlights and some of those just kind of little highlight lines, you can really break up that flat surface. And by giving kind of a cartoony sheen to those areas of flat gray. While you've got that bright wolf gray out, go ahead and hit the lenses on the front of the mech with it. We'll go over those again later, but that bright light gray makes a nice little base coat to paint those up as lenses later on. So the tricky thing about camouflage is that it's a lot of different colors all jumbled up with each other. And you could painstakingly highlight and shade every single one of those colors, and that would look great, but I don't feel like doing that. So instead, what I'm doing here is mixing up a bright light green that's going to function kind of as a universal highlight on all of the different greens of the camouflage. And what you're going to then do is take that light green that you've just mixed up and just do with kind of the edge of your brush. Note how I'm not really using the tip of my brush to draw the line, but I'm using the edge of the brush to kind of rub the side of the bristles along the corners of all of the different green areas. So with no regard for what green you're going over, that light green highlight is just going to go on every single edge of the camouflaged body parts. This is a nice shortcut for highlighting camouflage that'll give you a nice effect when it's all said and done, but is far, far faster than trying to individually highlight every single patch of green with a different highlight color. So just take your time, make those edge highlights nice and thin. It helps to add a little bit of thinner or water to your paint. And just go around again, any raised edges. You don't have to highlight every single edge. And in fact, you don't want to highlight every single edge. You just want to highlight the edges of the camouflaged areas that are on the upper part of that shape. You know, if you're looking at armor plate, you want to just kind of put an edge highlight on the upper edges of it, not on the bottom edge, maybe sometimes like half the sides. And once you've done that all over the model, you're going to end up with something along these lines. You can also use that same light green highlight to add some little scratches or battle damage. Once you've got the highlights on your camo, if you want, now you totally could skip this step if you are not comfortable with freehanding a design on the side. You just want to block in the design first. I'm blocking it in with a basic red and a light gray. For painting stars, it's nice to paint the outside edges first and then kind of fill in the gaps. So just like you would draw a star with a pencil, just kind of block in that star with a light gray, and then you can fill it in with white after. These aren't the final colors, you know, these are a darker, thinned down base coat just to get the shapes on there. And go slow, especially if you're newer to freehanding. And like I said, also, the mech's gonna look super cool even if you skip the designs on the shoulders. Once you've got the design blocked in with the darker color, you can go back in with a lighter color red using VALLEJO Blood Red here, and just put a little bit of the lighter red on the upper parts of the armor plate there, leaving the angled portion that would catch a little bit of shadow, leaving that a little bit darker. All right, so we took a shortcut with the highlights on the camouflage. We're also going to take a shortcut with the shadows on the camouflage, because for all the same reasons that it's difficult to highlight each individual color of the camouflage with its own highlight, it's also difficult to shade every individual color. So what we've got here on the palette is some VALLEJO black ink. This is a transparent black paint, and what you're going to do here to shade the camouflage is push some of that black ink into the shadowy spots of the model, the undersides of things, the cracks and the crevices. You're going to push a little bit of black ink in, and then you'll see the brush go off screen here. I'm washing the brush out in some water, coming back in with a damp brush, and then just kind of wiping the edges of the ink to create a kind of a gradient shadow coming from the ink into the unshadowed area. This here, this step is a little bit of a work at it till you're happy sort of stage. You could add a lot of shadows and make it really kind of a dark, broody miniature. You could just add a little bit of ink into the darkest crevices to add a little extra contrast. Start in the darkest areas, work up from there. You certainly don't want to overdo it and put black all over the camouflage that you've painted and highlighted. But this is a step where the miniature really comes alive. Getting that black into the cracks and crevices and then feathering it out really adds a lot of depth to the miniature. Remember to keep in mind the model as a whole. Don't just shade each individual armor plate. So like the camouflage that's on top of the mech is going to be darker than the upper part of the legs that's, catching shadow from the upper part of the mech. And so you can, make whole areas of the miniature darker than the brightest areas of the miniature. And just keep going around, like I said, keep working at it until you feel happy with the level of shadows. You could have already stopped at this point, or you can keep going to make it as shadowed as you'd like. Let's throw up the unshaded version there, and you can see a difference between the shaded and unshaded versions. It's pretty significant. All right, next up, we're gonna grab some blue ink. We're gonna do a quick wash of blue ink over those lenses that we painted light gray earlier, and just a quick wash of those is enough to give them a little pop, and the transparent blue ink gives it a nice, quick and easy kind of glowing lens effect. Up until this point, we've had a nice, shiny, fresh off the factory floor mech. So now let's add some battle damage. In a lot of the pictures of the Iron Bear, it's depicted with some blast markers on its nose cone, where it's been absorbing hits. And the easiest way to do that is to paint on the shape of the battle damage first in black. That's going to give you a base to work on top of, give you a define the area that you want to work with, and it'll provide a natural kind of shadow later that'll look like the camo paint job is chipped away. Once you've got your areas of battle damage defined with black, we're then going to grab the same grays we were using for the metal portions earlier and just carefully paint inside the black area that you did in the last step with that Stonewall gray. I think it's easier to paint inside the lines and leave a little bit of black than it is to outline the battle damage in black later. But if you're having trouble with this step at all, you could try using a micron pen to outline areas of gray. Similar to highlighting the areas of gray before, we're going to put now a brighter color on the battle damage, but this time we're going for a straight white. This is going to draw the eye to the battle damage and make it look kind of fresh and stark. And kind of putting some little dots of white inside the gray area to highlight the shape of the battle damage and make it look a little bit more textured than the miniature actually is. You can take a little tiny thin line of that white and drag it across any scrapes, and again kind of make it look like the battle damage is glinting and fresh. You could leave the base with the gray base coat, but I think giving the base a layer of VALLEJO charred brown will kind of set the miniature off, since there's a lot of gray in the miniature. I don't necessarily want a gray base, so charred brown for the base. All right, starting to fill in some of the final details here on some of the power plant areas on the back of the mech. While we've got some of that dead white left on the paint palette, I'm just going to go in and paint those areas with a pure white, and then once that's dry, I'm going to take the VALLEJO fluorescent yellow and give a coat of fluorescent yellow kind of all over the white. The fluorescent yellow is very thin. It's just going to kind of tint it a bright yellow, as you can see there. It's still pretty bright. But we'll come back to that and give it a little more love in a second. When working on one model at a time, it's sometimes nice to bounce back and forth between different parts of the model so that you can have one part be drying while you work on another part. Here we're going to put a quick dry brush of VALLEJO Beasty Brown on top of the base, and then lighten it up with a little VALLEJO Leather Brown while we let that fluorescent yellow paint dry. To break up the browns in the base, I'm going to give a couple little areas of the base a dry brush with the VALLEJO Cold Gray to kind of make it look like there's some gravel in among the texture. And then lighten that up with another pass of the lighter Stonewall Gray on the gray area. Just kind of break up the outlines of the base a little bit. For the black barrel tips, we're going to grab the VALLEJO Sombre Gray, which is a nice kind of a light to medium blue gray, and just give, similar to the edges of the armor plates, just give a quick highlight on tops of those barrels and outlining the front triangular shape on both of those barrels. There's kind of a curve on the sides where it kind of bends in, and we're going to leave those largely black, but just use that gray to catch the very edges. So with the fluorescent yellow fully dry, we're now going to go in and use a little bit of the VALLEJO rust effect to wash that into the power plant areas on the back of the mech. Just because it says rust on the bottle doesn't mean you have to use it for rust. It makes a nice thin down orange wash too. Now it's time to pull out the micron pen and start adding some of those Borderlands style black lining. I'm also going to use it to touch up the edges of the battle damage and bring it in to any of the seam lines of the armor. I didn't really pay attention to any of the seams in the armor when I was painting the camouflage before, and that's fine. Because you can then take this Micron, this is the .005 technical pen, and just kind of let that slide in all of the gaps and crevices in the armor, and just kind of go around the model, and that'll help define all of those armor shapes. And you can also put some of those little Borderlands style ... shading and weathering, which will make it feel like it's stepped out of the board game, stepped out of the video game. On the top of the mech, where there's some big curved panels that have little parts and protrusions, outlining each of those shapes with a thin black line helps to define those shapes and just adds some more visual interest to that big top part of the miniature. As a final detail on the power pack area, I dry brushed those areas with a little bit of white and forgot to hit record when I did that. So just a basic dry brush of some bright white after the orange was dry. And now I'm going to go back in with more of the same fluorescent yellow and just kind of give that a generous coat, going a little bit further out past the area of white dry brush to give it a subtle glow effect. And with this is going to be the final step in the process. So thank you so much for watching. We really appreciate all the Borderlands fans and miniature painting fans' comments and questions. It really helps the channel out if you hit like, hit subscribe. Big thanks to Monster Fight Club for providing the miniature for me to get some of these Borderlands painting videos done before the release of the game. I'm really looking forward to getting some of these minis on the table. A final little ... of some bright white on the glowing engine completes the glow effect, and you are ready to go. Well, again, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time for another Jolly Lark.